Hey Olivia, how you doing? So this is what I've decided to do, just to try to be ultra efficient, give you guys a sense of what I'm thinking, and give you guys something to kind of see and reflect on, and let me know, how this may or may not fit. So what I'm going to do, I don't know if I'll go down the whole list. I'm just looking at the list I have here, and I remember we talked about a new starting one, but I'm just going to do a few, and each one I'm going to try to make like anywhere from 1.5 to 3 minutes, just addressing a very specific point, but kind of alluding to an entire series that goes through these points. Okay, so I'll start by just kind of talking about the question or issue that I think I'm tackling in a video, and then I'll talk, and then I'll shut up, and then I'll give you another question or issue, and then I'll talk again. So maybe we'll have 2 or 3 or 4 of these back to back, so you can get a sense of how I'm thinking. Now, obviously, normally we'd segment these, but just to kind of get rolling, we'll go this way. All right. So the first question would be something like, what is a growth mindset? And sort of connected to that, what is the series going to be about? What's it going to tell me about a growth mindset that I don't already know? Okay. Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck, take that back. So a very powerful notion about education was forwarded by Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck, and it's the notion that she called a growth mindset. She in fact distinguished between 2 different kind of mindsets that a student could bring to their education. A fixed mindset was this notion that there's only certain things you can learn, only certain things you can do. So we can imagine students saying things like, I just can't learn math. That would be a demonstration of a fixed mindset. And that's what we don't want. We want our students to feel like they're capable of learning almost anything. And so the growth mindset represents that, the notion that the student is there to learn and grow, and that the educational people around them, the teachers and everyone that's helping them learn, also kind of assumes this and speaks to them in that way. And the idea being that if an educational institution really embodies this growth mindset, that will help the students to kind of raise, to the challenge and meet that challenge. And it's just simply the right context to have in a learning environment. I agree completely with Carol. By the way, my name is Steve Jordans. I'm a professor of psychology from the University of Toronto, and I really like to focus on having students learn through the process of both giving and receiving feedback. And as I've done my research, I've realized that while I agree with the power of a growth mindset, I also think it's much more challenging to instill than is sometimes implied. And so this following series will be me describing some of the challenges of instilling a growth mindset, but also giving some clear strategies and tips about how we can go about meeting and in fact matching those challenges, and really getting our students into that zone they need to be in to really learn and personally grow. Okay, there's number 1. Okay. And so this one would be more about the distinction of learning from skills, of learning skills versus learning information. Okay. Before we get into the issue of learning from feedback, I want to talk about a more general distinction that's relevant to all this. And that is the idea that while a lot of what we do in our education system is try to transfer information to our students, and a lot of our education system is built around that. But when it comes to learning and growing in that sort of growth mindset way, it's often more about skills like critical thinking and creative thinking and communication. So it's more about those skills than it is about information. And that's part of what makes a growth mindset challenging for students, is it really requires them to use skills that they may not have exercised very well. But that's also a potential opportunity if we can really help students achieve that growth mindset and have them practice it. In the process, they're going to be practicing these skills. And that's the important point I want to make here, is that information you can gain through simple exposure, but skills you only gain by using those skills and practicing them. And one of the really powerful things about the approach I'm going to describe now is the amount of practice students will get thinking critically, thinking creatively, and communicating. And so as they're learning to kind of hold this growth mindset, that mindset will also gain the strengthening support from all of these skills that students are developing. The same skills, by the way, that will help them succeed in virtually everything they do after graduation. So these are very great skills to build, and it's sort of a convergence of positives where we're simultaneously building the skills, but doing so in the context of this growth mindset. So now let's go ahead and talk about how that can all happen. Okay, so that would sort of be the end of video 2. All right, and now teaching a growth mindset through formative feedback. Okay. The educational context I'll be talking about a lot in these videos is one of having students both give and receive feedback, or what we're really going to call formative feedback. And what we mean by that is that we're not just going to give them feedback, but we're going to ask them to engage with that feedback and immediately put it to work, to use that feedback to improve their work. And that's a process that's called the formative use of feedback. And I believe this, is clearly linked to the idea of a growth mindset, because the idea is that they use that feedback to improve. And so we get sort of the growth mindset encapsulated in this little process whereby students get to ingest all this feedback that they've received from peers, and to decide what they agree with and what they don't agree with, and then to take the things they agree with and immediately use that information to improve the work that they're creating. And when they do that, at the end, they almost always realize that their final product was better, that it has been improved. And that's the real payoff for the growth mindset. So that's one of the reasons I like this context so much. And that's why we're going to be focusing on it throughout the remainder of these videos. I will see you in the next one. All right, so that kind of gives us... all right, yeah, okay. So now we're going to get to the great challenge. All right. In the first video in the series, I told you that while I agreed with the notion of a growth mindset, I've come to the opinion that it's in fact much more challenging to instill than we sometimes realize, or at least that we give credit for. And so I want to really focus on that point in this video because it's a critical point. Imagine a situation where students submit their work and then they receive feedback either from an expert or even from their fellow peers. Every time we receive feedback, especially constructive feedback, somebody telling us how our work can be improved, it can feel like we're being attacked. It can feel like that person is highlighting things we're not doing well. And it turns out we're very, very sensitive to attack. Think of just criticizing some significant other in your life. How do they react to that? The natural reaction to criticism of any sort is to fight it or flee from it. That fight or flee reaction. And notice, the idea of a growth mindset is that we want students to sit, think, learn, and grow. Fighting and fleeing doesn't really fit with that. And fighting and fleeing is the natural reaction. So it's not surprising that a lot of students don't even read the feedback we give them. Some studies show over 50% of students do not read feedback. And those that do are probably looking for something they can complain about. They are looking to fight. So the challenge of the growth mindset in general, as really kind of highlighted by that feedback context, is somehow getting students over this natural tendency to fight or flee, to somehow teach them how to have a growth mindset, because I would argue that a growth mindset is not natural. But that's okay. Playing guitar is not natural. But if somebody practices that skill enough, they can become very good at it. And so I believe in the same way, students can learn to have a growth mindset. But we have to understand that there is a challenge, that the natural reaction is to fight or flee. And then we have to find ways to really help them to overcome that natural reaction and get to the point that we want. Sit, listen, think, and learn. And that we're going to talk about in the remaining videos how we can do that, how we can scaffold the learning process to get them from their natural, more fixed mindset to that growth mindset that, again, will serve them well through the rest of their lives. Okay, while I'm at this, why don't I just stay at it a little bit and give you a sense? Maybe we can do this all in one sitting. Who knows? Okay. All right, so now let's get to brass tacks about how we can actually support students as they try to gain a growth mindset. I'm going to make a number of suggestions, and here's the first one in this video. Before we ask them to learn from feedback they receive, let's put them in the position of giving feedback to others. In fact, we can imagine both of these kind of happening together, but I want to really highlight in this video that when we begin by teaching students, what good feedback looks like, and we talk to them very seriously about the challenges of giving feedback, the challenges I just described in the previous video, that if your tone isn't right, if the way you present things is not right, you're just going to make that person want to fight or flee. So let's make them understand that as a feedback giver. Let's try to give them good coaching and good tips about what good feedback looks like and why it's so important to deliver it well. And then let's give them practice doing just that. When they kind of see the process from the position of the person giving the feedback, then they're better able to kind of understand that person's intention when they're receiving the feedback. So it's all about being able to share these two perspectives, to be able to look at your work from a different eyes, specifically from the eyes of the assessor. And so in order to kind of help a student do that, let's give them both roles. Let's literally give them both perspectives. And so that's my first tip. If we want students to learn how to grow from feedback, then the first thing we should ask them to do is to give feedback themselves. And we should teach them how to do that well. And with that under their belt, they will be better prepared to deal with the feedback they themselves receive. All right, so that was sort of what we had as for. To learn to receive, it's better to give. Now the process in some detail. Okay. All right, so we've started talking about how we can really teach students to have a growth mindset, and I've been kind of alluding to a process that I have in my mind, but now let me be very clear about what that process is and how I would see it unfolding. So typically, you would imagine 3 steps in this process. The first step would involve just asking students to do something, the kind of assignment you might give them already. So that could be a book report, it could be a lab report, it could be a critical analysis, whatever you might ask them to do. And so now let's imagine students all submit some work. Cool, that's step 1. Step 2 is what I was alluding to in my previous video. In step 2, they will practice giving feedback to their peers. And so here we would allow them to see some of the work that their fellow peers submitted. And there's a number of technologies, by the way, out there now, including one that's come out of our lab, where we can manage this whole process. So we can present them their peer work anonymously, randomly selected from the class. And we can now ask them to give some feedback to each of their peers, some constructive feedback, and maybe some positive feedback as well. But also, we have the opportunity in this step to teach them what that means. What does good feedback look like? And so that's what we would do, is teach them first, and then ask them to go ahead and practice that skill they've just learned about by giving feedback to a bunch of their peers. Okay, that's step 2. Then in step 3, while they were giving feedback to their peers were giving feedback to their work. So step 3, they're seeing the feedback they received. So now we're finally in that receiving feedback position after having given it. So seeing it from that side first, now they're receiving it. And what we do now is we don't just give them the feedback and say, there you go. Instead, we make it much more intentional. We're going to scaffold the process of learning from feedback. And step 1 is to make sure they engage with the feedback. So we literally ask them to analyze the feedback in certain ways. We ask them certain questions about the feedback. And that's going to encourage them to engage with that feedback, not to fight or flee, but to sit and listen and read. And then what we do, after they've analyzed the feedback from a bunch of peers, we give them the opportunity to use that feedback to make their original work better. And we tell them the professor will mark, or your teacher will mark, that second that improved piece. So you now have the opportunity to take the advice of your peers, make your work better, and get a better grade. And this is kind of important because it motivates them to engage in this process. So we're teaching them to read the feedback in a different way, to try to find the bits in there that can make their work better, and then immediately in a formative way to use that feedback and make their work better. And again, the real cool thing about this process is when they get to that step and when they actually look at the product after they've incorporated the feedback, they almost always feel like it's been significantly improved. They know my mark is better because I listened to the feedback. And so that step is a very rewarding step. So that's the overall process I think we want. Submit something, provide feedback to your peers, and then learn from the feedback you received. But in both of those second steps, we can also strongly support and structure the learning process in a way that ensures students are getting the most out of it. Cool. I'm just going to blast on through these. I'm on number 6. All right, in the previous video, I described that 3-step process that I think is key to teaching students how to have this growth mindset. You may have been looking at that or thinking about that going, okay, that all sounds very pie in the sky. Have them assess a bunch of peers and then have them see a bunch of feedback that they got. How the heck do you make that happen? How do you manage the logistics of that process? Well, it turns out there are a number now of educational technologies out there that can do that. And again, one of these has come out of my Advanced Learning Technologies lab because it's a process I believe in very deeply. And so we've created a technology that does this. It's called Peer Scholar, but it's just one of several that are now available on the market. And yes, to really do this right, you probably need a technology of some sort to assist you, because to really get the most out of the process, you want students assessing a number of peers and then getting feedback from a number of peers. That's what really puts them in that rich educational context that they can learn from. So this is the kind of thing where you want to seek out and find a technology to support it. But in so doing, I think you'll find something really great. First of all, it works. You know, that process really creates that deep learning and promotes a growth mindset. Secondly, though, students like it. They get it. They get the process. They like seeing the work of their peers and having a sense of how their work compares. And as they go through this process, they're continually being asked to think critically, to think creatively, to communicate, both in the sense of giving their thoughts, but also listening carefully to what others are saying. So it's a process that they really value and appreciate and want to see more of. And therefore, it's worth the time to kind of find that technology that can help you manage this process in a seamless way and give your students that rich educational experience. Alrighty. Sorry again. Now, the process I described does help students with that growth mindset and developing it. But I've alluded to this, and I want to just highlight this point along the way. It's one thing just to put them kind of through that experience. But as we go through that experience, one of the things these technologies allows is for us to do a little bit of micro-learning on the way. So there's this really powerful interplay that can happen when you're teaching students some skill. If you start with information about that skill, for example, these are the characteristics of good feedback. Here are the 5, characteristics that define a really well-delivered feedback to somebody. So you can have students learn those. But then if you immediately follow that information learning with application of what they just learned. So you do that just before they start giving feedback to peers. That's what really brings the learning from the mind to the body. That's what makes it a skill. And so there's really 2 skills in that process I described that we can really highlight. The first one is the ability to give good feedback to others, which of course is a valuable skill in and of itself for anybody that's, say, going to be in a management position or anywhere where you're overseeing a team of people. But the second skill is then being able to learn from feedback and to show that growth mindset, or that sort of coachable attitude, we sometimes call it. And that's what the third step is all about. But once again, that's not an easy thing. We have that fight or flight reflex. And so if we can do a little micro learning that, for example, both motivates students and informs them. So we might imagine having a little video just before they go and learn from feedback that describes to them that, yes, it is challenging. Here's why it's challenging. Here's why you're going to feel certain emotions. But here's the reward if you can learn to get past those emotions and actually show growth. And so we can describe to them situations like a work environment where maybe a manager does give you some feedback, and maybe you do take that to heart and you change your behavior, and the manager sees that change. They now think you are able to grow into things. If I have this new position and I'm trying to think who could fill it, well, I might think of you, and I might think, well, I don't know if they have the skills right now, but I think they could develop them, because you've demonstrated that ability to not fight or flee, but to sit, think, and learn. And so we can convince students that this is a skill that many of their, say, competitors, for lack of a better term, won't develop. And so if they do develop it, they are going to have this very strong advantage that's going to help them all through their life. Okay, so imagine a video that kind of describes that, and another one that kind of describes the optimal process from learning from feedback. And then we say, okay, go do it. So once again, they get access to the information and the motivation, but then we sort of ask them to use what they just learned actively, by demonstrating an ability to learn from feedback. That mixture of micro-learning followed immediately by practice is extremely powerful and an extremely important way to scaffold this extremely important skill of developing a growth mindset. So I want to highlight the value that micro-learning can bring at every step along in this process. Hey, welcome back, and thank you for watching all the videos. This one's the sort of cherry on top, as it were. The process I described, especially when it has all the micro-learning and scaffolding, is indeed a very powerful one, and one where I think we're really doing our students a service by doing that right. But there's another advantage to this process as well. And that comes about when you ask students to use rubrics from both sides. So let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine we had some validated rubric for, say, critical thought. So for example, the Association of American Colleges and Universities has created a bunch of these kinds of rubrics. And so they have a rubric for critical thought. So imagine you were going to ask students now to display critical thought. You were going to give them some task where they were supposed to do a critical analysis of something, and you show them this rubric ahead of time, and you say, here are the components of critical thought. And by the way, when your work is scored, these are the things people are going to look for. So to start, use this rubric and have it there when you're creating your critical analysis, and have it guide you as you go through. And so they're going to start learning about what critical thinking looks like as they do that. But now imagine they submit their work, and in that second step, we now say, all right, you're going to now see the work of, say, 5 of your peers. And now what we want you to do is apply that rubric to their work. I want you to score their work based on this rubric. So now we're putting them on the teacher side of the rubric. And they are now looking at the work of peers and saying, okay, how's the organization of the information? What sort of evidence has this person brought to support their claims? The kinds of things that might be in the rubric, they now go looking for in the work of their peers. And so now they're kind of seeing the rubric from a different angle, and occasionally a peer will just nail it, right? They'll come to a peer's work that really does a great job at this, and suddenly they'll really get it. They'll see, oh yeah, I can see all these characteristics now, and I can see why that work is so powerful. And so it really produces a deeper sort of pedagogical understanding of what you're asking them. What is critical thought? What is creative thought, etc. By using those rubrics from both sides, you can deepen that learning. You also do something else. If a given student's work is scored by, say, 5 or more of their peers, each of whom apply a rubric. So say they're applying a rubric to my work, then there's a lot of research now showing that if you average those 5 or more peer grades, those scores on the rubric, you actually get a good measure of my skill. So not only do we have a great learning experience here, we have the ability to measure where all of the students are on that skill as they go through the activity. And so we can measure things like critical thought and creative thought and oral presentation skills and all of these skills that we value. We can measure those skills at the same time that we're exercising those skills, all while developing a growth mindset in our students. Perhaps you now see why I'm so passionate about this process, because quite honestly, I don't think there's anything that provides the rich, powerful, and relevant learning experience that this does. And I would highly encourage everybody to look into the formative peer assessment process and consider using it in your own classes. Thank you very much for your attention through this series. I appreciate it. Best of luck with your teaching. And if you need support, if you need help, OneHE is here. They're great people. I work with them and really appreciate all they're trying to do to support teaching and quality teaching in our community. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.